A new wave of disruption is on the horizon. The pandemic has disrupted everything. The war in Ukraine has broken globalization, and the next wave of upheaval will hit our jobs. Listen to this carefully. 14 million jobs could be eliminated in the next 5 years. 14 million. That's the prediction of the World Economic Forum. They've published a survey just ahead of the International Workers' Day, also known as May Day. It's today, the 1st of May. Workers around the world marched on the streets today. In France, there were massive protests. 1 million workers hit the streets. Many of them are opposing President Macron's new pension policy. We've been discussing it on the show. What about the rest? What are they protesting? Around the world, women and men are marching on Labor Day to ask for better wages, better living standards, better working conditions. But the job market is changing, and changing dramatically. We are in a period of disruption, and we have advance warning. But are we prepared for what's coming? Are we prepared for the loss of another 14 million jobs in 5 years? The report I just mentioned, it surveyed more than 800 companies around the world, and this is what it found. Employers will create 69 million jobs by 2027. 69 million new jobs. But they'll also eliminate jobs. How many? 83 million. And the difference is 14 million. That's the number of jobs that will be lost. So employers will slash more jobs than creating new ones. And you know what will drive this change? Technology. Artificial intelligence. It will change the workplace as we know it. It will have both positive and negative impacts. It will create jobs for those who can develop and manage AI tools. It will also take away jobs like those that involve record keeping. In fact, the World Economic Forum has made this prediction. It says 26 million record keeping jobs are at risk. They could be eliminated by 2027. So technology will be a big disruptor whether we like it or not. But it won't be the only disruptor. The job market will also be hit by slower economic growth and higher inflation. Also, a major risk that stares us in the face is a redundant workforce. Around the world, 6 out of 10 workers will need training. 44% of a worker's skills need to be updated. Turns out a lot of people do want to upgrade themselves, but they don't have enough opportunities. Only half of the employees surveyed say that they have adequate access to opportunities. This is the global picture. What about India? Well, India will not be insulated from these changes. The World Economic Forum report has a prediction for India too. It says the Indian job market will also see a churn. New jobs will be created in emerging sectors like AI and machine learning. So the shift is quite clear for everyone. The question is, are we ready for it? And the short answer, I'm afraid, is no, we are not. Around the world, labor unrest is on the rise. Dock workers have staged walkouts. Rail workers and public servants are protesting. Ports around the world are witnessing agitations. Let me show you some data, in fact. In 2021, there were just 8 cases of protests and strikes at the world's leading ports. Last year, this number shot up dramatically. From 8, it went up to 38. That's a jump of almost 400%. Why are so many workers angry? They're deeply impacted by the growing inflation. They say their wages have been stagnant for decades. They want a raise. And we've seen this before. In the 1800s, there was a series of protests. From Germany to France, England, and the US, workers had a single, simple demand. They wanted their work hours reduced. They were working for 12 to 15 hours. They wanted this reduced to just 8 hours a day. And this led to the first round of May Day strikes. In the US, the May Day protests began with a bloody massacre. The year was 1886. Workers took out a rally in Chicago. Again, they wanted to work for fewer hours. They assembled at the Haymarket Square. Suddenly, bombs went off. Unknown attackers targeted the workers. It led to a massive riot. At least 11 people died. This event was a turning point in American history. It led to major labor reforms in the US. And this was more than 100 years ago. The job sector is dramatically different today. 60% of the jobs in existence today were not even around in the 1940s. We are in the year 2023. The world is at a similar crossroads. Today we are witnessing fresh protests. But do we have a solution? Not immediately, but we do need a solution urgently, and policymakers must act, else they'll have a new crisis on their hands, a crisis of jobs, or joblessness to be more precise. Those who have a job want better wages. But the reality is this: The companies that employ them are looking for ways to hire fewer people. And technology is driving this disruption. It's inevitable. Our best bet is to innovate and prepare. How was your weekend? If you have savings in an American bank or if you work for an American bank, chances are you spend the last few days worrying about your finances. That's because another US bank has collapsed. We're talking about the First Republic Bank. It is the second largest bank failure in American history and the third bank failure since March this year. First Republic has been teetering for weeks now. 2 months back, it got a cash injection. 11 banks came together to save it. They injected $30 billion into First Republic, but the bank could not be saved. So this weekend, American regulators made some tough decisions. They took over First Republic, and now JP Morgan Chase will take over its assets. This has triggered more uncertainty. Is the US banking crisis ending, or is it getting worse? It started with the Silicon Valley Bank. We told you about it. It was the first American bank to collapse this year, the Silicon Valley Bank. Then another bank fell, the Signature Bank in New York. Days later, First Republic shot into headlines. This was in the month of March. The bank had lost some $100 billion. There were mass withdrawals, depositors began to flee, and now this bank is being bought. It's quite a dramatic story, in fact. First Republic is into private banking. It mostly serves the wealthy. The bank was started in 1985 with less than 10 employees. By July 2020, it was the 14th largest bank in the US. It had 80 offices, 80 offices in 7 American states and a staff of more than 7,200 people. It looked like a solid bank until crisis hit and it began to crumble. For perspective, look at these numbers. In January 2022, that is last year, one share of First Republic was trading at $200. In April 2023, this year, last month, one share was down to less than $5. So from $200 to less than $5. That's a fall of over 95%. And it's not like the bank did not try to avert the crisis. In the last few months, it tried to cut costs and sell assets. It decided to fire 25% of its staff, to lower the amount of outstanding loans and curb non-essential activities. Plus, it got a rescue package, the $30 billion I told you about. 11 banks gave this money in the form of deposits to First Republic, but it seems none of it was enough. And last week, the regulators took a call. They were going to take over the bank, and this weekend they pulled the trigger. After hectic activity, a buyer has been found. It will be JP Morgan. It will take over most of the assets of First Republic. This includes more than $100 billion in deposits and almost $230 billion in other assets. This includes loans and different kinds of securities. And with that, another messy bank takeover in America is now complete, which brings us to the next question. Is the banking crisis now over? Or is it just beginning? Is it getting worse from here? Honestly, it's hard to say, but here's something that we can say for sure. This crisis was avoidable. And the blame for it should go to America's central bank, the US Federal Reserve. It failed to act. And these are not my words. This is an admission from the central bank itself.
Good afternoon.
They have released a report, an assessment of the Fed's response to the crisis, and this report highlights some clear shortcomings. It says there was a lack of oversight and US officials failed to anticipate the threat. In fact, let me quote from that report. Federal Reserve supervisors failed to take forceful enough action. SVB's failure, that's Silicon Valley Bank, its failure demonstrates that there are weaknesses in regulation and supervision that must be addressed. Supervisors did not fully appreciate the extent of the vulnerabilities as Silicon Valley Bank grew in size and complexity. When supervisors did identify vulnerabilities, they did not take sufficient steps to ensure that Silicon Valley Bank fixed those problems quickly enough. So they're talking about Silicon Valley Bank, but it applies to the larger banking crisis in America.
The Federal Reserve issued its long-awaited report on the cause of the Silicon Valley Bank failure. And while it put the failure squarely in the hands of management and its board for failing to oversee a safe and sound business plan, the Fed did put some heat on itself that its own bank regulators did not respond quickly enough and forcefully enough to conditions on the ground.
So the US central bank messed up, and bankers around the world paid a price for this. You may remember these headlines. This was right after the collapse of Silicon Valley. Global banks lost $459 billion. Financial stocks took a nosedive. The crisis traveled as far as Europe. It claimed a Swiss banking giant. Credit Suisse was taken over by rival UBS, and it brought back memories of 2008. The global financial crisis of 2008, of course, it was much worse than what we're seeing right now, but it confirms our worst fears. When America sneezes, the world catches a cold. When American financial system makes a mistake, the world foots the bill for it. Do you remember the Indo-Pacific? I won't blame you if you don't. It was all the rage before last year, but then Russia invaded Ukraine and suddenly all the attention is back on Europe. But that does not mean the Indo-Pacific is doing any better. The Chinese threat is still there. Maritime incursions, unnecessary military drills, it's all happening in the shadow of Ukraine. But that's the thing about geopolitics. You cannot afford to be distracted or myopic. You must be ready to multitask. The question is Joe Biden up to that challenge? Well, his schedule certainly says he is. The US president hosted the South Korean president last week. This week, he's hosting the president of the Philippines. And later this month, he's hitting the road. Papua New Guinea first and Australia after that. All these trips and summits are focused on one region, the Indo-Pacific. Let's begin with the ongoing one. The president of the Philippines landed in Washington on Sunday. This man, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., a.k.a. Bong Bong Marcos, that's what he's called. He'll be meeting Joe Biden later today. It promises to be a tough balancing act for him. On the one hand, Marcos wants to deepen his ties with the US, forge an even stronger relationship, he says. Those were his words. At the same time, he's keen to be on China's good books. He has promised a quote-unquote golden age in relations with China. So it'll be a balancing act. And for Joe Biden, this meeting is already a concession. Let me tell you why. Senator Biden was a critic of Marcos Sr. This was back in the 70s and 80s. Marcos was a dictator. He ruled the Philippines for 20 years. Now his son is in power, and President Biden is courting him. The same son who has lawsuits pending against him in US courts. He is being welcomed by the US president. So much for putting principles first. Looks like Biden has suddenly discovered political pragmatism. Either way, today's talks will heavily feature defense. The US has access to 9 military bases in the Philippines. The assumption is they will be key in the defense of Taiwan. Now, Marcos has tried to play it safe so far. He granted America access to more bases. At the same time, he stopped them from storing lethal weapons. Sort of like a half measure. Biden will be hoping to bring the Philippines firmly into his corner. His job is to reaffirm US commitment on 2 things. One is mutual defense. The second is financial assistance and development. So that's Joe Biden's agenda this week, getting the Philippines on board. Later this month, he'll be traveling to Papua New Guinea, the first American president to travel there in more than a century. And that should tell you something about the neglect. In Papua New Guinea, Biden will attend the Pacific Islands Forum. 18 leaders of the Pacific Islands will be present. So will the leaders of Australia and New Zealand. Interestingly, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi will also be in the country. He too will meet the Pacific leaders. And that should tell you how much attention this region is now getting. In fact, Joe Biden's Pacific pivot started last year. He hosted Pacific leaders at the White House. He also pledged aid and dispatched Vice President Kamala Harris on a tour. Now he himself is on the job. The question is, will it be enough? Because the US has long ignored these islands in the Pacific. It had unmatched military power in the region, so nothing else mattered. Not financial aid, not infrastructure projects, not climate change investments. But China was playing the long game here. China is now the biggest bilateral lender in the region, much bigger than America and Australia. It has funded more than 100 projects. I'm talking about roads, airstrips, ports, strategic assets with civilian and military uses. China has an investment in all of them. And last year, it pushed for even greater influence. China pitched a security pact with 10 Pacific nations. It was a sweeping proposal. Reports say it would have given China military bases in the region, even allowed them to deploy troops. Thankfully, The Pacific nations rejected it. And that rejection should give Biden some hope. But if he wants to recruit Pacific Islands against Beijing, he must do two things. A, put his money where his mouth is. The Pacific Islands need help to fight against climate change. It's an existential threat for them. They need millions of dollars in investment to tackle it. And secondly, Biden needs to build a broad coalition. The US alone cannot convince the islands, but a broader alliance of democracies can, which is why Prime Minister Modi's presence could be a game changer here. The Pacific Islands have already been let down by the US, Australia and New Zealand, but India is different. India is a member of the Global South, and it's now on the high table. India's lessons and skills could be key for the Pacific region. In return, New Delhi will also get some valuable diplomatic support, because don't forget, every vote counts at the UN. And the Pacific Forum alone has 18 votes. All these meetings and trips will conclude at the Opera House in Sydney. That's where the Quad leaders are meeting. It's not going to be an easy mission for Joe Biden. You can't neglect countries for decades and expect them to support you later. Biden's test will be convincing Pacific leaders about his campaign slogan in 2020, that America is back. And now it's time for Vantage shots, images that tell the story. Starting with the US, a powerful tornado in Florida overturned cars and destroyed houses. Authorities are cleaning the debris and assessing the damage. In China, a wingsuiter successfully flew through the Tiananmen cave, becoming the first Chinese man to ever do so. In Venezuela, Russian gymnasts participated at the Alba Games under their flag. And finally, what makes May the 1st significant, apart from the fact that it's May Day? We're taking you back in history. On this day, Fidel Castro banned elections and declared Cuba a socialist country. The year was 1961. Castro was addressing hundreds of thousands of Cubans at a May Day parade. He identified himself as a Marxist and Leninist. This happened right after the US government made an attempt to overthrow Castro's government, but was unsuccessful. He was unapologetically anti-American. It established close ties with the Soviet Union. During his rule, Castro created a one-party government. He wanted to control all aspects of Cuba's politics and economy. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Holy cow.
Oh my God, it's like right in front of it. Oh my
Email exchanges from inside the BBC. They talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony. The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.